Space Marine Praetors are some of the most renowned warriors in the Horus Heresy, each one having decades of combat experience and their own unique fighting style and panoply of war. Because each one, in my own mind at least, is such a unique individual character, I can't bear for my Praetor models to be a carbon copy of the same model that everyone else is running. So in this video, I'm going to take the stock sticking the sword in the air Praetor model from the new Age of Darkness box set and make it my own. This is a fairly advanced conversion, as it does involve a bit of precision cutting and sculpting, but I think there'll be some valuable insights in this video, no matter what your level of comfort with conversions are. I started off on this model by roughly following the instructions to build the legs and the front torso piece. But there were a couple of things with the model I really didn't like, so I knew I had to make some modifications. The first thing on this model that had to be changed was the oversized WWE Championship belt buckle. The decision to include this on the model is a bit of a head scratcher for me, as I can't think of any other Space Marine model or artwork previously that had such a massive pie plate in the middle of the torso, and it had to go. At this point, I was not quite sure which legion I wanted this Praetor to belong to though, so my options were wide open, and after digging around in my bits box, I came across this chest piece from one of the Blood Angel Sanguinary guard models that had sculpted on abs that I really liked the look of. Luckily, this dinner plate posing as a pant suspension mechanism was a separate piece from the front torso, so I just left the piece off and used my clippers to remove the bulk of the plastic of the waist of the Sanguinary guard torso, and an X-Acto knife to carefully carve out the abs I wanted to use on my Praetor model. When doing this, I took my time to make sure I didn't damage the abs of the Sanguinary guard chest piece, and once the piece was removed, I dry fitted into the designated hubcap storage compartment on the front torso. I did run into a bit of an issue here though, in that the abs were thicker than the area I was trying to place them would allow, so I had to clip away a part of the waist piece, as well as carefully scrape away some plastic on the back of it. When removing plastic in this way, it's always best to carefully remove the small amounts you want at a time and repeatedly check the fit, as it's far easier to remove plastic than just to sculpt it back in or have a sunken in piece, so being careful here with your cuts will always pay off. Once I was happy with the fit of the ab part, I glued it on the torso, but there's a bit of a gap between the upper chest piece and the part I just added, so I busted out my green stuff and got to work. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm not super comfortable with green stuff still, but I'm trying to get better, and I think the only way to really do so is by keep on practicing. For this model, all I really did was press some green stuff into the void with a wet, flat sculpting tool, and then used my tool to carefully carve out the additional ab lines I would need in the armor. This part might seem a bit tricky, but as long as you take your time, you should be fine. I also tried to round off the edges of each ab, so that instead of being boring rectangles, they looked similar to the plastic abs I was trying to imitate. Despite not liking the original belt buckle, I really did like the mini skulls that were attached to the belt. After a quick couple of cuts, I was able to add this bit around the new lower torso I added with pretty minimal fuzzing after gluing the legs together normally. This is where I ran into my second major snag of the model, and that's these armored thigh warmers. These pieces were super cool and had a ton of bulk to the model, but one of them has a sword strap to it that is kind of hard to get around. I don't really like additional doodads hanging off the side of my models, as it makes posing them a lot harder, and I know I wanted to change the pose of this model eventually, as we'll see later. But because this sword was sculpted onto the thigh armor, and in addition to the sword was hanging off a couple pieces of leather that stretched across 3 different parts of the model, I really had no choice but to include this bit. Otherwise, I faced a pretty daunting task of removing the leather strap across 3 other parts, which would be kind of a nightmare and have to resculpt large chunks of the Marine's armor. No sooner had I glued on these pieces though, I realized that the original belt buckle had an additional buckle that connected onto this thigh piece, and without it, the belt holding up the sword was just hanging in midair off the thigh. So I tried a couple of times to cut out and reuse the buckle from the belt, but eventually I gave up as the bit was far too fiddly and just sculpted a really rough belt buckle and strap of my own, and then added a Blood Angel doodad hanging off of it. This sculpting was a bit of a pain, and there's a really good chance I would have rethought my choice to not include the original belt piece if I knew that there was going to be these knock-on effects. And I guess I could sit back and blame myself for not reading the instructions first, but instead I'm going to get really salty with Games Workshop for adding on superfluous details that are next to impossible to leave off without a pretty large cutting and resculpting effort. I think crap like this is a major reason why we have so many characters that look the exact same, as any conversion effort on them outside of a head or possible shoulder pad swap is a massive effort and most people don't want to do. Before I launch fully back into a rant though about how back in my day the old multi-part plastic characters in 3rd and 4th editions were the pinnacle plastic characters, I do want to answer a question that I know many of you still have watching this in your head, and that is, if you hate the model so much, why are you spending time converting it? And honestly, there are some really good things about this model. The leg, tabard, and chest armor are all top notch, and I think they fill in the Artificer armor gap quite nicely. I also had the Age of Darkness box and didn't want to waste these models, so here we are. Also, the padded collar of the armor is fantastic and I think represents a great example of additional details that are not over-designed. Moving back though, to parts of the model I really didn't like, I knew that the pose had to be changed as I thought the stock one was pretty goofy. And to start with, I cut away all of the arm nubbins off the torso, as I knew these would make it difficult to pose the model more naturally, and I could always resculpt the detail I'm cutting away later on if I feel like I need to. For the left arm, I did a pretty simple swap where I just used a Praetor's power armored arm from the Forge World Praetor kit to swap out what I thought was overly designed Volkite pistol, or Volkite Serpenta, sorry, with an Archeotech pistol that just, I think, looks better, is a little more elegantly designed, and it's not as freaking big, honestly. The right arm, though, was a little bit more involved. At first, I started off by carefully cutting the hand away behind the wrist. My original thought was to rotate the arm lower to be more of a guard pose, as that would be a pretty straightforward conversion that would make the overall pose much better with minimal effort. I did have a couple of reservations about the size of the sword, as it's ridiculously big, but at this point I thought I could still make it work. So after the hand was cut off, I tried to reposition the arm to be held closer down towards his waist, but the sword on his hip kept getting in the way, and any pose that I tried to do here just was unnatural because the hilt of the sword on his hip kept getting in the way of his actual weapon he was trying to use. So instead I decided to have this guy settle for a heroic sword point off to the right pose, which I know is a pretty generic trope for Space Marine characters at this point, but I didn't really know what else to do, as I was not going to go and kind of carve off the sword of the hip after complaining about it so much previously. I tried out a couple of different right arms first, including a Phoenix Terminator arm as well as a Praetor power armored arm. Eventually settled on one that was from the Forge World Mark III Close Combat Weapon Upgrade kit. It's a pretty simple arm, but has the pose that I wanted, so I'm going to go with it. The arm was originally intended to be held at the side of the body though, and instead I wanted it pointing out further to the right. So I drilled 2 small holes into both the arm and the torso and attached them together via paperclip at the angle I wanted. As you can see here, there is still a small gap left though, which I will sculpt some flexible armor later on, but for now I move on to the weapon itself. I started off by trying to get the original sword to fit, as I really liked the design and the hilt was pretty cool. But unfortunately, it's just too damn big. Like, I know 40k is known for having oversized weapons, but this sword is truly massive and kind of, in my mind, goofy actually. I just can imagine this guy kind of walking down a hallway and trying to hit an enemy while getting stuck on a conduit or the wall, as it's literally, I don't know, 10 feet in real scale. So yeah, it had to go. After rummaging around my bits box a bit, I found this Blood Angel's Dawnbreaker Spear that I really liked the look of how the hand was actually holding the weapon. The actual spear itself though was a bit unwieldy and too big for what I was going for, so I decided to cut down the spear shaft but leave the pommel of the weapon to make a pommel of a sword. One of the reasons I chose this bit though was because I really liked how the hand was gripping the spear shaft and didn't want to lose that positioning. So I cut the spear shaft a little bit higher than the hand itself, drilled out a hole in the spear shaft to weaken the remaining shaft. I'm using shaft way too much here, but anyways. And then used a sharp X-Acto knife to carefully cut away all remaining resin and leave the finger behind. This is very similar to when we were cutting away the ab piece before, that I'm making very small and delicate cuts here, as again, it's far, far easier to scrape away small bits of plastic and take your time than try to re-sculpt a finger or reattach a finger later on. For the replacement weapon, I had this short sword from Conversion World lying around my bits box as well, and thought it would make a nice Paragon blade. So all I really had to do was cut off the hilt of the sword, drill a hole into both the Blood Angel's hand as well as the Conversion World sword, and then glue them together with a pin in between them to reinforce the bond. Luckily for me, the sword's hilt was the perfect width to fit nicely into the carved out finger I did before. So the look I was going for with this finger wrapped around the hilt of the sword works pretty well, and I'm really happy with the end result. As mentioned before though, there was still a bit of a gap under his right arm, so I filled it with some green stuff and carefully sculpted some parallel ridges in the green stuff to represent flexible under armor of the connection between the arm and the torso. I was careful here to try to keep the lines as parallel as I could and sculpting them clearly as possible. But at the end of the day, it's going to be covered up by a shoulder pad and no one is going to look this closely at your model, so I'm not too concerned about getting it perfect. Now that the arms and general body of the model was done, I had to move on to the head and shoulder pads to finish the model off. The shoulder pads were a bit tricky though, as once again Games Workshop made a very weird decision to have these shoulder pads be larger than anything they've ever released for a Space Marine power armor model before. So my extensive bits box didn't really cover a decent sized shoulder pad for this model. After digging around in my bits box though, I found these Emperor Children Phoenix Terminator shoulder pads, which are in effect a Tartar's armor shoulder pad, that I thought fit pretty well in this model and added to the overall Artificer armor appearance without looking too overdone or out of place proportionally. By this point in the model, I decided I wanted to make this a Blood Angel's Praetor, so the Emperor's Children icon on the left shoulder pad would have to go. Luckily though, the half wing and blood drop icon is a pretty common Moffat in the Blood Angel's iconography, so I was able to just carve out the eagle claw of this, and take a blood drop from a Blood Angel shoulder pad that I carved off, and attach it where the claw was before to turn this from an Emperor's Children shoulder pad into a Blood Angel's one. Finally, for the head I just grabbed a Palatine Blade head as it has this filigree that I think again is appropriate for Blood Angels, but for your model you can use whatever power armored head you want here. They all fit pretty nicely and go in with maybe just a little bit of green stuff to build up the neck joint. For the last bit swap on this model, I cut off the clunky iron halo on the backpack that was just too large for the model I was going for, and replaced it with a smaller winged skull emblem from the Blood Angel's plastic upgrade kit. This was a pretty simple part swap, where all I did was take the two pieces, drill a hole in each one, and run a length of paperclip between them to pin them together. As always though, it's worth taking your time here to ensure that the holes line up correctly and are right in the middle of the backpack, or else you'll have a piece that's just a little bit off-center and look kind of wonky. And with that, my Praetor is done and ready to get to painting. I still have the base to do with this model, but I'm a bit at a loss of what basing scheme I want to go with for this new army, so if anyone has any ideas, I'd love to hear them below. Also, I hope this video inspired you to convert your own Praetor, as I do think these characters should have their own unique models in their army, and not just be the same copy-pasted plastic Praetor that everyone else is going to be running out of the Age of Darkness box set. As always, thanks for watching, and hobby on.